Mark?
Oh, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm not sure what we're doing here, but it's a continuation of What Now? And we have our
What
new
next?
Irish friend, Paul Mooney, joining us today in a just a lovely romp through inquiry philosophy. We'll see where this goes. I have nothing brilliant to say. World is still alive, and how many months are we into this pandemic? But we continue to explore new avenues of hope, and hopefully that's what this conversation will bring us. Over to
Thank you,
you,
Mark.
Nika.
Thank you, Mark. So please ignore Mark. He's just woken up in Canada. So he's just trying to make sense.
I haven't had coffee.
He's coming out of his
God.
dreamland. But yes, welcome back to our show, which is from what now to what I feel and we also believe is what next. Because what now started, this was, we created this platform just for dialogue, as our guest today is big on dialogue as well. So from what now to what next? What is happening in our world now? Let's explore with our very interesting guest from Ireland, Paul Mooney, his introduction, because I just loved what Paul said to me. And I asked him, how should I introduce you? And he said, a druid speaks in lyric rather than logic. So this is going to be a lyrical dialogue, and we're looking forward to it. Over to you, Paul. Welcome to our show. And I just let us know who is Paul. Welcome.
Thank you for the welcome. Thank you for the introduction. Banachdi Nashi live. I give you the blessings of the Shining Ones from Ireland. And the Shining Ones are a tribe called the Tuatha De Danann. And mythology has it that they came in a boat and they landed about 300 kilometers from here on a mountain in smoke, and they became the earliest deities in our land. And Tuatha De Danann means the tribe of the goddess Danu. And so pre-Christian, pre-Crown, pre-IMF and World Bank, the Irish were worshippers of the goddess Danu. And Christianity came to Ireland in the year 432 AD, when a man who had been a slave here minding sheep when he was a child came back. And the written story was that St. Patrick came to Ireland to share Christianity with the Irish. But Rudolf Steiner wrote in 1923 that St. Patrick came to Ireland to learn about Christ consciousness from the Druids. And even in the year 600 AD, the chief Druid of Ireland said, they persecuted us with the knowledge of somebody that we already knew about. And even though they harmed us, we never forgot who he was. So I come to you from an ancient land. Yesterday I was in a stone circle that was created about 6,000 years ago. And the stone circle was the place in which the Druids, men and women, so ancient Celtic ways of life always recognized the equality of the male and the female, the sky and the land. And in fact, the Irish king didn't marry a queen. The Irish king married the land and was responsible as the conduit of energy and connection between Father Sky and Mother Earth. And in fact, if there was a famine, the king could be sacrificed. And so even here in these days in the archaeology museum, there are 2 bog bodies. That's bodies that were buried in a bog, each of them about 7,000 years old. And so there's something about the ancient ways of kinship and kingship and sacrifice, which I'm trying to bring back today. So imagine when I say to a chief executive, if you're really the king, would you be prepared to be sacrificed if your system isn't whole? And imagine what they might think about that. And would you believe I am finding CEOs who really are serious about wanting their systems to be whole. And so as we speak about wholeness, I bring in something more modern. So my relationship with a guy called Professor David Bohm, B-O-H-M, who I never met. He died before I found his work. But Bohm was a contemporary of Einstein, contemporary of Niels Bohr and Robert Oppenheimer, who at the time when quantum mechanics was being developed, was one of the only guys to say, excuse me, I know what you're counting, but you're not counting this. And he called it the implicate order. And in fact, he was barred from America. He had joined the Communist Party because he thought they were talking about Hegel, but they were talking about something else. And during the McCarthy era, they sent him away as a communist. And in fact, the main reason they wanted him to appear in court was that they were trying to get to Oppenheimer, who was actually a communist. So anyway, Bohm was sent to Brazil, and in Brazil, he wrote a paper called The Hidden Variables, pointing to the fact that beneath what was being measured, there was a higher order, which he called the implicate order. And so he sent the paper, and Oppenheimer held a conference, and he said, what can we find wrong with his math? And they said, nothing. Well, then he said, we better just ignore him. And that's what happened. So he was an ignored physicist, and then he went to Israel, and then he went to the UK. And in the UK, Nika, he met Jiddu Krishnamurti.
I'm also a fan of Bohm.
And so, great. And so when Bohm and Krishnamurti met, they realized they were pointing to the same thing from different perspectives. So you had theosophist, philosopher, Krishnamurti, and then you had the quantum physicist, scientist. And so they had this dialogue for about 25 years. Much of it was recorded. So I think what's really interesting is the possibility to bring back the ancient teachings, whether they be Sufi or Mayan or Colombian or African American or Taoist or whatever, and bring them into the modern through a process of dialogue. And for me, dialogue's about sitting in circle. It's about dropping beneath what is in the explicit order, accepting that thought is the problem.
Exactly.
Especially when it's not mine. Yeah, when it's not
mine. That's where I would like to come in. Because the implicit order, when you say, is that now in the world when we are so fixated with measuring everything, you know, we want to measure everything. We want to measure happiness. We want to measure consciousness. And then where is the implicit order in this? Because I'm asking you this question because this is what my writing is about as well. When you ask me about Islamic economics or finance, I'm saying there is a hidden order. The providence and sustenance is coming from somewhere else. we're just killing ourselves. You know, we're trying to control and manipulate the process and the order. So what are your thoughts on this? And I don't know if Mark would like to add something here.
Yeah, Mark.
I think just building on Anika, I'm steeped in measurement, and actually it's, Paul, you might be interested. I have read some of Boehm's stuff, and Steiner, of course, but I'm interested in this notion of consciousness, and can consciousness be measured? So I just wrote a paper on this saying that I think if consciousness is frequency and that sort of logarithmic relationship with divinity, then I think it is a sort of an attribute, I think, that can be felt or experienced, certainly experienced, if not measured in any quantitative mathematical form. So again, not that measurement is the be all end all by any means, because we're spiritual beings. We have a heart and a soul, and we experience them in ways that are non-quantifiable ultimately. So this what I'm intrigued with, is that dynamic between our desire to measure and then our sort of joy of realizing you can't measure anything. I'm an economist, can't measure GDP really, or
Exactly.
they're all proxies, they're all estimates, and so what
and
in fact
that is the reason I was asking this question, or posing this question to both of you, as in, then the challenge is multifold. It's like for us, like you, Mark, as well, that we understand all this, but the world, how do we make them understand that there is another order, the implicit order, which cannot be measured? But people don't understand about all these, graphs and measurements. So let's see where we go from here.
So can I?
Yes.
Bring in my thinks, not my thoughts, my thinks, because I'm only thinking them now. That's why I'm writing them down.
I love
they're
the
new
thinks.
and they're fresh. Yeah. So these are my thinks. Has anybody asked if consciousness wants to be measured?
Exactly.
I bet you she doesn't. And every time you get close to her, she'll move to the next place because she's continuously expanding. So it's pure Heisenberg. Pure Heisenberg. So anybody that's trying to measure consciousness, have you asked her? Can you even meet her? I think that's the first question.
Paul, I have to interject. I've been all weekend. I've been in dialogue with a friend in New York who, she said, you're the only person that I've met who can calibrate consciousness, and we're in a very high conscious circle of people, and so it's interesting. We did double blind testing, so we used David Hawkins' work, which is on consciousness, and he developed this logarithmic scale, right? But it's just they're just numbers, and what do the numbers mean? So what's fascinating is we discovered that blind testing 15 individual people independent of each other, that we're still out, right? There's still a delta between us, and you'd think that if the number is just a number, and if I say 500 is love, then we should be plus or minus 5 basis points on any same individual. But in fact, that's not what happens. So you're right. So consciousness is like moving, and it's also affected, I think, by what Jung would say, the shadow side. There's a shadow side to all of us. So I might actually be picking up on a shadow side, whereas my friend isn't, because she just sees their pure essence, their pure love, pure light. But I sense a shadow side, so it brings down sort of my average, shall we say. Anyways, it's fascinating. It is a moving target. I agree with you.
So I think I'm going to ask Paul about his quantum balance sheet. So what does this imply or mean to anyone, especially in the context of what we are discussing here?
I'm not ready to tell you.
Okay.
because I want to finish my think.
Your thinks.
I want to finish my think, because the think that relates back to you, Anika. So Mark just said he did a double blind test, okay? Anika, you and I this morning were talking about the word blind, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So you said the Sufi mystic said he wishes everybody was blind so that he could be met without an exterior image.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And
so
I said to
don't
you,
recognize our persona and judge us from that.
Yeah. So we were talking about blindness this morning, Mark, and I said the Irish word for blind is dal, D-A-L-L. And so when we checked it in Punjabi, it's a shield, D-A-L-L is a shield. And I was just in Limerick, okay, coming back to you. I was just in Limerick, and I was in a place called Loch Gur, where they found a shield. I forgot to say this, Anika, this morning.
Oh my God!
I've seen a chieftain's shield. Okay, it's in the Museum of Ireland now. They found it when they drained the lake. Okay, and it was a ceremonial shield. Where did the king wear his shield? On his back. Why? Because that's where mostly kings get stabbed. So this issue of blindness, I think, feels really important. And maybe at Mark, consciousness would only reveal herself to us if our eyes were closed. So that, pointing back to your double blind. And coming back to the issue of measuring, I mean, it was either Socrates or Plato who began to talk about the measure of a man. And obviously we mean the measure of a woman. So as long as we're measuring something which is not human, it'll always be apart from us. But I want to draw our ancient law, which is called Brehon, B-R-E-H-O-N, Brehon law. And Brehon law was a circular economic system that was in place for at least 10,000 years until the church and the crown came to this little land. And every man and woman had an honor price. So that was the price to be paid if my honor was broken. So if a property deal went wrong, if a marriage went wrong, if a contract went wrong, I knew my honor price. And if I was swindled, the honor price was paid. It was as simple as that. Now, what if everybody who worked in Google had an honor price and you knew it was 27 cows? So if somebody was slighted and the Brehon said, I agree, this man was slighted, pay him his honor price, I bet you we wouldn't have crime today. You could marry. So everybody protected their honor price. So if we're going to measure something, I'm saying let's borrow from the ancient ways, bring it into a modern methodology, that's fine. But if we all are capable of accessing our honor price, now this is where, for me, as my thinks are moving, it splits into two. So my own internal honor price comes back to my self-identity, my communal identity. In the African culture, it's called Ubuntu. I am me because of we. I only exist because I'm part of a community. If I lived in the forest and I foraged, who would know I was even there? And what contribution could I give in society if I was outside it? So I think there's something about measuring an honor price which feels really important. Fine. And I said, and I asked them, is it optimum? And they said, what do you mean? I said, are you maxed out? I mean, is everybody working at their optimum in the entire organization? And they look at each other and they usually laugh, okay? I said, okay, it's not optimum. Okay, so then we look at the cost of sales. Same question. Non-labor expenses, labor expenses. Okay, so nothing's optimum. So that's interesting. So where do you think your optimization comes from? And they say, oh, the market or the money or the product. And I said, no. Your optimization comes from your consciousness. Your collective consciousness is creating your reality. So if you're creating 20 billion, that's your reality. Now, what if we could dissolve the fragmentation that's happening in your executive team? And by the way, there's plenty of it. Ego, baggage, wounding, fighting, yeah? Imagine if we could dissolve some of that fragmentation. And let's say you're 20 billion, you're operating, well, we could even put it on a scale. Let's say you're operating at 70%. And we get that by simply asking them on a scale of 1 to 9, how optimal is your revenue? Nobody's going to answer 9, not even the head of sales, would you believe? Anyway, we get a number and we say, okay, 70% is 20 billion. Now, what's 71%? And the accountants go, oh, well, it's 1% of 20 billion. We say, no, it could be double. You've no idea what it is, because that 1% exists as a quantum potential. Begin to access their quantum potential. And then once we do that, we then physically link it to the balance sheet in 140 different places. And we end up with something which can be lensed through the IIRC6 capitals, or it can be lensed through King 4, or it can be lensed through anything you like. So we are beginning to look at the relationship between the intangible aspects of a collective and the tangible aspects of the measurements that take place, making sure that the collective are measuring the quality of their relationships, the quality of their dialogue, quality of their thoughts, and their thumps, the past tense of thought. And once we help them to realize that the way they do business is perhaps incoherent, once it becomes a little bit more coherent, guess what? They get more of whatever they focus on. And if they're focusing on profit, that's fine. All we ask them to do is make sure they're creating value without harm. So that's the only thing we're saying. And then they have to define harm for that system. It's different in every system. And then we have to drop it into every single layer of the organization, from the chairman to the tea lady. And that's what our cohesion intervention is. That's what I've been crafting over the last number of years. So it's not just a theory or a measurement instrument. It's a full-scale, integrated, collective leadership, executive and staff development modality. And then we use modern technology like chatbots to measure what's going on and make those links to the P&L and the balance sheet, so that what's being measured is actually being created in real time.
This is something similar to Mark's work as well.
I'm curious, going back to your honor price, once, you know, I think you and I know Anika and Robert Dullner and I have sort of similar aspirations, that we see that from my accounting background, that all assets are integrated. They form in the indigenous culture, a medicine wheel, a wholeness, not like Maslow's pyramid, but and of course it's very much in the Celtic, you know, Celtic imagery. So when you look at the balance sheet through that integrated relational model, my question is, how does an honor price get revealed? If I use that heavy word price, particular, since we know that price isn't, or value isn't simply a snake around a stick like a dollar, but it's revealed in more intangible qualitative terms. So I'm curious for you to riff on the idea of this honor price, as you've talked about optimizing, you know, the balance sheet. And I totally agree that 1% is not just a normative uptick. It could, you know, as relationships could be infinitely possible in terms of love, or what, you know, then we get into the notion of logarithmic consciousness, but I'll stop there.
It seems to me that in the old days, the honor price was known from the time the child was born. Okay, and in African traditions, the child is sung to while in the womb, okay? And that's the song that is played at their funeral, because that song is passed from generation to generation to generation. So there's something about knowing the being that is part of the system. I mean, how many corporations have we worked in where you have a meeting with people and you have no idea who they are? You don't know what they do. So I think there's something about honoring the wholeness of the human being that's part of your, let's say, economic system. So I think that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is, once the social strata is known, you got to take the Gini coefficient into effect, right? So if the chief executive earns 400 times more than the tea lady, there's something wrong.
Absolutely.
Right? So compressing it in some kind of, let's say, system of that your value that you give to the organization is recognized, let's say along 6 capitals: intellectual capital, human capital, social and relationship capital, yeah, as well as financial, manufactured, and natural capital. So imagine if every member of the system had a contract, not just physical contract, but a psychological contract that says this is the value you bring to the organization. And if this is dishonored, your honor price is 7 cows. Anybody that messes with you, they have to pay you 7 cows, okay? Now, it's the triangulation that creates justice. Because you go to the Brehon and you say, that person promised something and they didn't deliver it. And so you go to the Brehon, and in fact, you could choose your own Brehon, okay? And the Brehon would triangulate, would listen fairly, and then their advice was binding. And that comes directly back to Carl Jung. It comes back to the Celtic wheel. So it's thesis, it's antithesis, and it's also synthesis. It comes back to a trinity. Yeah. It can come back to anything. It can come back to the sun, the moon, and the stars, the heart, the head, and the soul. So it's that triangulation which creates justice. Now, what we live in the West is not a system of justice. It's a system of law. And coming back to blindness.
Law, yes.
Lady Justice has a blindfold. So I think if we are to come back and offer new insights and ways for systems to become more conscious, I think there are plenty of ways in the past, and not just Celtic. I mean, Viking and Sufi, and I mean, I was with a Colombian shaman over the weekend, and he was talking about their cosmology, their stories about how the world was created. And the way he described it, I said, but what you're talking about, we call Atlantis. And I said, Atlantis was probably destroyed by a comet called the Younger Dryas 12,000 years ago. And the flood came, and the people from Atlantis who went to the west, they became Indians. And the ones that went east, they became Druids. And the one that went to the north, they became the Viking pantheon. And then the ones that went to the south, I mean, they became yogis and spiritualists and Sangoma. If you go further, you see the Taoists. So I think there's something to be said about let's borrow from the ancient past, bring it into the modern with the dialogue. And for me, dialogue, Mark, taps into the collective shadow in a way that is psychologically safe and allowing people to observe their thoughts as they are happening. So I'm a Quaker, which means we sit in silence as a Quaker, yeah.
Awesome.
So we sit in silence as a gathering. And I remember running a dialogue process for a group of 40 Quakers. Now, silence is quite normal in Quakerism, okay? So I ran this dialogue process, and I explained to them at the start, I said, dialogue is where you observe your thoughts as they're happening. And if you feel like sharing it, well, then you can, and they won't be judged, and we can unpack them together. But this particular Quaker meeting was particularly silent. And I had said, it's okay, you can speak. And at the end I said, we were unusually quiet for Quakers. Somebody always has something to say. And one woman stood up and she said, I was so embarrassed by my thoughts. I thought it would be better to shut up by the photocopier. That's where consciousness could arise in a completely different way.
So coming back to that, yes, please go ahead.
You know, I believe that everything, I always say all the answers are in the circle. Like when we listen to each other, it's
exactly,
you know, the conspiracy guys to the, you know, it doesn't matter. It's like everyone has an opinion. Everyone is a think, as you're saying, Paul, and what a beautiful experience when we just honor that process of respecting that next voice and not interrupting. So I'm in, as a modality, I'm intrigued with your experience and reflections on
this is what I was also going to say, that we've actually forgotten, or maybe we're just too controlling. We've become so controlling that we exert control over everything. So dialogue is, of course, missing. So my question to you, Paul, would be, I'm intrigued to know that, yes, the dialogue is missing big time, because people have sort of forgotten how to mutually respect each other and each other's opinions and give each other that space. So the dialogue has gone missing. So the second part is, what happens after the dialogue? Do you think that, I'm a big believer in dialogue, and that's why we started What Now, and Mark is as well. We thought, if we can't do anything, at least we can initiate a dialogue and, you know, just create this dialogue and just listen to people. And that was the purpose. But do you think that the dialogue should lead to something? Does it lead to something? And would that bring any transformation?
It's a lot of questions.
I know. That's how my brain works.
Which one are you interested in, really?
So,
pick one. Pick one.
Yeah,
think.
Whatever. Yeah, whatever makes sense to you.
Can I push back a little?
Yes, please.
Ask me the question you're afraid to ask me.
I'm not afraid,
You're not afraid.
at all.
Okay.
No,
Okay.
Why would I be? I'm just saying I'm a big fan of dialogue. But then where would the dialogue take us? Do you think it should lead us to something? And do people take action then?
Okay, so it depends. So what I've been doing over the last 12 years is testing and implementing different modalities. It depends on where it is in the system. Yeah, because what used to happen was I'd go to the CEO, he'd look for some support, and he would say, "Oh, fix everybody else, and we'll be fine." And I'd go to everybody else, and they'd say, "Fix the chief executive, and we'll be fine." And, okay, here we go. In fact, if I'm invited into an executive team, the first thing I ask for is for the table to be taken out of the room, right? And I just set up a circle of chairs, and the guys walk in, and I swear to God, the blood drains from their faces. Yeah. And even if you're black, I can see it. I can see the blood coming out of your face. What's this? And simply sit in a circle, and they all sit down, and it takes them 7 minutes to squirm, right? And I'm just silent. I'm just sitting there, and I'm looking at them like this. And I say, "All right, welcome." And I introduce myself, and I get them to introduce themselves. So that takes a half an hour, yeah? And once there's a settling, depending on where the group wants to go, it's like, so I'm here today. I'll tell you what I'm capable of doing. What would you like to do today? And that's what we do, yeah? So in a group that's willing to do that, they can go anywhere they like. Once we tap into the collective wisdom and the consciousness, they can do anything, yeah? Anything they like. Now, further down the organization, let's say project management, executive staff, We begin our process like that. Okay, so it's kind of an open space, and we allow them to come in and access the collective conscious. But then at the same time, work has to be done. So we've developed a shorter practice, which we call a digilog. Now we put that online. So it's a 90-minute process online. So that's more formal. There's a problem presenter. There's some dialogue processes. There's some actions. We record the actions. We record the learning. So it's actually a learning process under which problems are found, not problems are solved, because the issue is that if everybody walks out of that meeting with a different perspective on what the problem is, they create 12 new problems. And so once, no matter how they're fixing it, because they're all fixing the same issue. And guess what most of the issues are? The people in the circle. I mean, it's not rocket science. The people are the problem. Yeah. It's their attitudes, their thunks, their thoughts, their baggage, their wounding, whatever you like to call it. Okay. So we've crafted several different versions of dialogue. We've crafted dialogues for 2 people. We've crafted dialogues for 3 people. So we crafted the methodology, which can then populate all over the organization. And we like to work in a pod. We call it a pod of about 250 people. And in 90 days, those 250 people will go through a process we call cohesion. Now, why did we call it cohesion? Because if we call it dialogue, people think they can do it, and they can't. Yeah? So we called it something they can't. So, I know how to do cohesion. We say, no, you don't. And that's okay. So, and then once that 250 people operate literally at a different vibrational frequency, we start to get phone calls. Can you do what you did with those guys? Because they're having different emails, different texts, different conversations in the corridor. The water cooler conversation is completely different. And so we like to work on those. And it's like, Mark, you're saying the medicine wheel. So they're just medicine wheels that populate the entire space. So
you are creating
does that
a
answer
village.
your question?
Yes, it has. So you are now developing or creating a village where this cohesion or dialogue would take place, right? Would you like to tell us about that?
South Africa for 12 years. I got back in December. I mean, I landed here. I did a DNA test, and I did a test on my family name, only to discover that the Mooney family, the Maonaigh, had been Druids since at least the 6th century, and before that unrecorded. So I really tapped into something which was ancient in my blood, and then I started accessing the Celtic heritage. I started accessing the sacred sites, and I was literally visiting sacred sites, walking in forests, walking in the land, and then lockdown. So I went, okay, now what? Or what now, as you say. So I had to decide what to do, and I wanted to experiment to see if what I was doing in physical circles for 12 years, and I've worked with about 10,000 leaders in 20 countries, and I'd come back to Ireland, and I didn't know what the level of consciousness was like here. So I said, I wonder if we can use technology as a way to create distant intimacy. While everybody is busy with social distancing, I'll see if I can create distant intimacy. Yeah. So I set up a weekly dialogue, 2 hours every Tuesday, and started calling in my community. And we would just open this space, and not like this, because I'm talking too much for a dialogue. But I had all of a sudden, I had 16, I had 20. Now we have 60 people in 17 countries dialing in once a week just to hang out, share ideas, and sometimes we had a topic and sometimes we didn't. Okay, so once I realized that that was possible, and as I was accessing this Celtic wisdom, I realized there are 150 million Celts on the planet. And I said, well, what if we could share what the Celts had been doing 5,000 years ago, create a model for it, and maybe we could do something. So the Celts are Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Isle of Man, Cornwall, France, Spain, and Portugal. Yeah.
Why just the Celts?
Well, I was just because I was here, and I said, okay, I need to create some kind of an affinity group, or I won't have to explain to somebody what is a Celt. So I said, okay, I'll give myself a couple of years, and then I started imagining what went on in the village. Okay, so there was a healing process, there was a food process, there was clean water, there was ceremony, there was music. I said, okay, it's fine. How am I going to do this? Oh, I better create a bank. Who has all the money? Okay, I'll make a bank. Right, let's start there. So I rang Robert Delner and I said, Delner, I want to make a bank. How do you do that? Some healing work, conscious companies. And then when I added in the cultural aspect of music, food, healing, I said, we need a physical place where 40 of us can go live there together, and we'll build earth houses and make it eco-friendly, and we will do an Airbnb for another 50 units where all of the healers and the practitioners and anybody who wants to do anything, and we create these dialogue lodges, which I had on a download at the end of the Mayan calendar. I was in a sweat lodge at the end of 2012, and I got this idea for a physical space.
Where? What?
I was in the sweat lodge in Johannesburg.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah. And I got a download, and it said, build these places. So we can have these circular spaces where the community comes and sits in circle and does leadership development work, and has fire and makes tea and whatever we do. And once we can create that, we invite in the people from the local community. And because we're in the digital era, we can invite in anybody we like. And then I said, okay, once we figure this out, and we said, okay, let's try and figure this out to create an equal circular economy, healing, food, water, and that's what I've been doing. So I've been... I put a crowdfunding idea on a platform a couple of weeks ago, and people are interested. And the ones I'm meeting are tired of the rhetoric, and they're tired of the broken economic model, the broken social model. I mean, I walked around Dublin City in December, and there are 10,000 heroin addicts sleeping in streets. Saying, what? Seriously? I mean, can we not organize ourselves in such a way? So I started a project that works with people who are displaced, only to realize that addiction is not their problem. Trauma is their problem. And the trauma happened when they were under 7 years of age.
Exactly.
I mean, I looked at the recovery system here that has a success rate of 5%. And I asked, how much are you spending on that homeless person? Mark, 24,000 euros per month.
Yeah, I know.
Spent to keep that man homeless. I'm going, what? So the entire economic system around recovery is incoherent. And of course, I don't want to create a system. It's just a system. So I want to create a process of going into the woods with those men. And that's the healing system. That's where the healing will take place. You tell a man he's a Celt, and then his blood is from the Druid, and you're a warrior, my brother, and that's waking a man up. So we talked about that earlier on. How do you wake a man up? You tell him who he is. And that is an internal awakening. And in my case, it's just a Celtic consciousness. And it could be the same. It could be the same in Bangladesh. It could be the same in Rwanda. I don't know if it's true, but I read this morning, Rwanda have just banned French as the national language and replaced it with Swahili.
So
Now,
frankly, I'm not a big fan of that, because I feel like, you know, we have to be inclusive. So we either, you know, tilt towards being really exclusive, or when I think the world has tested the inclusion experience, which the inclusion project, which might have failed. So I feel like we should be in the middle ground, like, you know, I believe consciousness is not, you know, Celtic or, you know, African. It's just consciousness as us human beings. And that's how I feel. So that's why I was asking you, why just Celts? It should be open to everybody, whoever wants to be healed and part of that community or village.
Yeah.
That's how I feel. That's the universality. I feel like we all feel the same way. We all bleed the same way. So my solidarity with universality is this, that it's just not just the human soul, it's the cosmic soul, it's the divine soul, it's the triangle.
Away with it. That's all. I get away with it.
That's right.
Yeah. People look at me and say, where were you born? And it's okay, get that, yeah. So I'm not trying to culturally appropriate anything. I'm saying this is what can work here in this part of the world. And I absolutely agree with you. We just happen to tap into consciousness from a particular lens. And as Mark was talking about, you know, the weather and the land and the fruit, this is our lens on the world. We got 200 days of rain a year. So our version of consciousness is, thank God it's raining again.
Yeah, exactly.
It is specific to a land or a place, but I think, I don't know, I feel like now is the time maybe we have to get over this, go past this.
That were over churches in Ireland. It's called Maonaigh. And this is an honoring of the female form.
Like Astarte.
Yeah?
Yeah.
And these were present on the lintels of the Christian churches. Yeah? So I think for a certain amount of time, coming back to Anika's question, can we honor two belief systems? I think that's what the Celts managed to do, because Christianity was coming in with their cross, and we worshiped the sun, but we ended up with a Celtic cross, which is the crucifix and the circle. And I think what you see there is the Sheila Nagai, is the honoring of the feminine, but I think that's been lost over the generations. If you look what most patriarchal and dogmatic systems have done to the feminine. So it feels really important to me to re-empower not women, but femininity.
Yes.
And the art of listening and nurture and relationship and silence. And so for me, dialogue is a feminine modality.
Agreed.
And the question is, can a group who go into dialogue move into their masculinity, into their action and into their agency? And I'm able to say absolutely. And we can tell you what the numbers will be on the far side as well.
So my next question is related to Celtic heritage. And it's, I don't know if you ever heard of the Vedrus peoples, the Rus of Russia, of the taiga. So they claim that this ancient people are contemporaries of the Celts, and they had similar burial chambers, dolmen, and there's a remnant of these people still in Siberia, and it was written up in a very kind of interesting set of books called The Ringing Cedars of Russia. But cedar, I'm a forester, cedar, it was misinterpreted. Kedar, the Russian, actually means pine. not cedar. So it's actually Pinus siberica, the Siberian pine, which is similar to the white pine. So in this set of books, this woman called Anastasia, who is a remnant of these Vedras ancient people, said we are contemporaries of the Celts, and so their society sounded very much what you're reflecting on. They called them spaces of love. They had they didn't have war. They had this incredible relationship with nature, and it was the balance of the male female. The child, before you were 8, you already knew who your soul partner was going to be because you heard her or his song. As you're saying, every child born in the Crusade is an answer to a prayer, so a song. And so all of this was written up in this series of books, and you could read it and say, oh, that sounds like some Snow White legend that couldn't have possibly existed. But the question, and some people have said, well, let's try to recreate these villages, these conditions in which these people lived. And their first encounter was with the elite Roman legion who came up there. They didn't know what to do with them. They returned to Rome, and the emperor scolded them and said, how come you just didn't decimate them? They said, because they didn't have any modality of war. And then it was Prince Vlad who went to Kiev in 980 or whatever, and drove them back into the forest, called them heathens. So I'm intrigued with your tapping into the Celtic and Druid knowledge and wisdom. Is what gives you hope for the emergence of this new kind of modality in the face of this, I would say, a pandemic of fear and trauma, as I think you wisely identified. Because I think that's the nature of the show too. This conversation is like, okay, what do we do tomorrow? I mean, yeah, we're in trauma. There's heroin addicts. There's lots of trauma. It's manifest in many ways. But can we actually honestly create these conditions in which these ancient modalities can be restored? Or do we have to go through even more tough love before we kind of crack this matrix? And that's a big comment, and just open for conversation, really.
Yeah, I hear you, Mark. Thank you for the awareness around the Vedras, and woods are very important over here, and the oak in particular. So sacred groves where the druids, the men and the women of the forests, met. In fact, druid means the man of the oak, men of the oak. So as I hear your question, I'm asking, why does love have to be tough? Maybe it's time to be more gentle. I mean, corona is the Latin for crown, okay? And the way I figure out the coronavirus is the queen, Mother Nature, Pachamama, whatever you want to call her. We call her Danu.
Pachamama.
She just took off her crown and she threw it on the ground and she said, no more, enough.
Exactly, enough of you.
Enough. And so she had a respite. Not long enough, in my view. I hope there are more lockdowns. But look what happened. Chemtrails disappeared. Carbon footprint disappeared. Smog disappeared over Chinese cities. You had dolphins.
PM2.5 levels went down. Yeah.
And the Schumann resonance went up.
That's right. Except for last week, apparently it was flat. So
okay. Yeah. So we're coming back into our sleepfulness. So we're starting to congregate. And I mean, what happens when people congregate and some have masks and some don't? Some don't. I mean, that's now. It's the new racism, whether you're a COVIDian or not.
There is an ancient saying, and I reflect on it oftentimes when we sit in circle, is the sacred tree legend, which is, we've wandered so far from that sheltering branches of the sacred tree, which was like the Kabbalah, right? And because of our drunkenness or desire for knowledge, you can go back to the old, whether you believe in the Garden of Eden story, but it makes sense. And the legend says we will having, been under a spell, finally wake up and crawl back to her perfection of completeness, right? So this is what excites me. And I think that's why these conversations are so inspiring.
So we keep the dialogue going.
Well, I wrote, it's interesting, the synchronicity. I wrote a piece in my Facebook page this morning about the Garden of Eden. So I have an apple tree outside. And when I came back to Ireland, I needed to make myself a wand. Okay, so this is what I bring into circle with me, and it's made from apple. Okay, so the apple's harvested this morning, and I posted this morning, and I said, tree from which my wand is fashioned. Today I shall bake deep apple pie. So the tree of knowledge, I mean, just think of the story, really. We weren't supposed to have the knowledge. And what gives us knowledge? Apples don't give us knowledge. Accelerate consciousness. And I held my breath back because you just said it.
No, I'm against the idea of accelerating. I'm saying it's a progression. It's a natural progression. It cannot be accelerated. When people talk about raising consciousness, and you can't.
I agree.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree. We can only raise our awareness and our awareness of what is, yeah? And if you take ayahuasca, that'll happen in 6 hours. I guarantee that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I understand. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Paul. This was really interesting, and I hope we can continue to keep us posted on your village and how it's progressing and what's happening. And please open it to Muslim Sufis as well. I want to come there.
You have an open invitation to the Cranog.
But whatever, it'll happen too.
Okay.
But actually, not serious. Our dear friend is in Limerick. She's